A lot of people think fear in war comes from the big stuff: tanks, bombs, artillery that shakes your bones. But there was one crude British weapon that shook seasoned German troops in a different way because it didn't look scary at all. It looked old. It looked slow. And then it erased squads so fast that some veterans swore it felt worse than shells landing nearby. Before we jump in, if you like WW2 stories that focus on the gritty how it actually worked, tap subscribe so you don't miss the next one. You're gonna want the full payoff on this. Now, picture Normandy, 1944. Not the wide open desert, not big sweeping lines on a map. This is hedgerow country, tight lanes, tall green walls, and fields that turn into little fortresses. You can't see far, you can't move fast, and every road feels like a trap. At one of these crossroads, a German infantry unit is told to push forward. It's a pretty standard order in an infantry war. Advance down the lane, close the distance, clear a British position a few hundred meters ahead. The officer points. The men get ready. But a veteran in the group, the kind of soldier who has already lived through brutal fighting earlier in the war, does something that shocks everyone around him. He doesn't step off. He doesn't even pretend to. He refuses. That kind of refusal in the German army wasn't a small thing. Orders were life and death. Discipline was everything. And a flat-out refusal could lead to a court-martial or worse. So why would a proven combat veteran risk that? Because to him, that hedgerow line ahead isn't just enemy infantry. It's a specific kind of enemy. British infantry. And not British infantry because of their tanks, or their artillery, or some secret weapon. British infantry because of their rifles. That sounds crazy at first, right? Germany had been fighting riflemen for years by then. Everybody carried a rifle. Everybody knew what rifle fire sounded like. You took cover, returned fire, maneuvered, called in support if you needed it. But this veteran had learned something the hard way. There was a certain range, especially in tight terrain, where going head-to-head with British rifle sections could turn into a slaughter. Not always, not in every fight, but often enough that the fear became real. And the problem was this: British rifles were supposed to be outdated. German intelligence had looked at the British standard rifle before the war. It was a bolt-action design, rooted in an older era of warfare. On paper, it didn't look like the future. It didn't look like the kind of weapon that should dominate modern infantry combat. Modern war, the thinking went, was moving toward semi-automatic rifles and more automatic fire at the squad level. So if Britain still leaned hard on bolt-action rifles, that had to mean British infantry were behind the times, right? That assumption sounded logical. It was also a deadly mistake, because what mattered wasn't just the rifle. It was what the British soldier had been trained to do with it. And that training turned an old rifle into something German troops struggled to believe until they experienced it. The first major warning signs showed up early in the war during the fighting in France in 1940. German units reported something strange when they ran into British infantry positions. They described fire that felt like automatic bursts, fast, steady, and hard to lift your head under. But the shots didn't have the exact sound of a machine gun. It was like hearing single rifle cracks, just packed so close together your brain didn't know what to do with it. At first, German troops assumed they were dealing with well-placed machine guns. That would make sense. The British did have light machine guns, and any good defense would use them. But when German forces overran positions and looked at what had been shooting at them, the numbers didn't add up. There weren't enough machine guns to explain the volume of fire. They found mostly riflemen, regular infantry, holding regular rifles. That mismatch, what they heard versus what they found, created a puzzle. Some German reports noted it as odd, maybe even impressive, but not yet terrifying. Then the campaign ended, the British Army evacuated at Dunkirk, and the Germans moved on. For a moment, that mystery got buried under bigger events. But it didn't stay buried, because after Dunkirk, German forces didn't stop meeting British infantry. They met them again and again, across different terrain, different years, and different kinds of battles. And the same pattern kept showing up. North Africa, Italy, Northwest Europe. Different units, same complaint. British rifle fire was coming in too fast, too steady, and too accurate. That combination, speed plus hits, was what made it so nasty. Here's why. Lots of troops can fire fast if they're just spraying rounds and hoping, but fast and accurate is something else. That's pressure, that's training, that's skill. A German officer in the desert might attack a British position expecting a rifle platoon to fire like riflemen. Sharp shots, some pauses, maybe a machine gun or two. Instead, the attack would slam into what felt like a wall of lead. Men would drop before they could close the distance, and the German side would be left thinking, where are the machine guns? Then they'd take the ground and realize it wasn't a nest of heavy weapons. It was mostly rifles. Doing a job rifles shouldn't be able to do at that pace. Now, if you've ever handled a bolt-action rifle, even in a safe, controlled setting, you know the basic rhythm. Fire, work the bolt back. Push it forward, get back on target, fire again. That process takes time. Even with practice, there's a limit. German estimates for a skilled rifleman were usually in the range of a dozen to maybe 20 aimed shots per minute if the shooter was really moving. But German troops were describing something closer to 30 rounds a minute, sustained, and with real hits. That shouldn't have been normal, so what was going on? The answer is the thing that German analysts missed when they judged the rifle by its age. The British Army had spent a long time building a rifle culture, one that went back well before World War II. They didn't treat the rifle as just a rifle. They treated it as the center of infantry combat, and they drilled soldiers to run that rifle faster than other armies thought was realistic. There was even a name tied to it, the Mad Minute. Now, a lot of people hear that term and picture some kind of one-time stunt, like a circus trick. But for British riflemen, it wasn't a party trick. It was a standard, a baseline, a way to prove you were ready to fight. The basic idea was simple to describe and brutal to execute. In about a minute, a soldier was expected to fire a high number of aimed shots at a distant target and actually hit it, not just make noise. And it wasn't only for elite marksmen. British training pushed regular infantry toward speed and accuracy together. So how did they do it? Part of it came down to the rifle itself. The Lee Enfield had a smooth bolt action compared to some other designs. It could be worked quickly when a soldier really knew what he was doing. But the rifle alone doesn't create that kind of performance. Technique does. British soldiers learned to keep the rifle planted, shouldered, and steady, while cycling the bolt in a tight, practiced motion. Instead of dropping the rifle, breaking their aim, and then finding the target again, they trained their hands to run the bolt while staying in the fight. The weapon didn't come out of the shoulder. The shooter didn't reset after every shot. It became a rhythm, a loop, fast enough that from the other side, it could sound like something automatic. And once German troops faced that rhythm up close, especially in places like hedgerow lanes where you couldn't just flank wide, it left a mark. Because now you had a problem. You couldn't confidently rush, you couldn't easily peek, and you couldn't count on the usual assumptions. You might hear what your instincts say is a machine gun, but your eyes tell you it's riflemen. That split second of confusion is deadly, and for soldiers who survived long enough to learn patterns, it changed their decision-making. Some didn't call it fear, they called it calculation. If a hedgerow held British riflemen trained to fire fast and hit hard, the simple advance down the lane stopped being simple. It started looking like a meat grinder. And that's the moment we're going to dig into next, because the most dangerous part wasn't just the speed, it was how British training made that speed show up under stress. In real combat, when other soldiers would slow down, that's where the Lee Enfield stops being an old rifle and turns into something German veterans never forgot. By the time German commanders started paying attention, the pattern was already locked in. British riflemen weren't just fast on the range, they were fast when it mattered, when they were tired, scared, pinned, and running on instinct instead of calm thinking. That was the part German doctrine didn't prepare their soldiers for. German infantry training focused heavily on careful marksmanship. Ammunition mattered, fire discipline mattered. You shot when you had a good reason, not just because you could. Machine guns handled suppression, rifles handled precision. The British flipped that idea on its head. To them, speed was precision. British soldiers didn't learn rapid fire in quiet conditions. They practiced it while instructors yelled, rushed them, and deliberately broke their focus. They trained while exhausted. They trained while stressed. They trained until running the bolt and firing accurately happened without conscious thought. So when combat hit and stress skyrocketed, British riflemen didn't slow down. They stayed fast. That difference showed up again and again in real fights. In Italy, German infantry supporting a machine gun position believed they had a British unit pinned. Their MG had been firing steadily, forcing the British to stay down. This was textbook suppression, nothing unusual. Then the German gun crew had to change barrels. The firing stopped for a short window, half a minute, maybe less. That was all it took. British riflemen popped up and fired with shocking speed and control. By the time the German machine gunners tried to resume fire, both gunners were dead. The British hadn't panicked. They hadn't rushed blindly. They'd been watching. They recognized the firing pattern. They knew a pause was coming. And when it did, they dumped accurate rifle fire into a known position faster than the Germans could react. The supporting German infantry later described the moment with disbelief. The British were supposed to be suppressed. Instead, they acted like predators waiting for an opening. That report included a warning. Never assume British riflemen are truly neutralized just because they're pinned. Pinned British infantry, the report stated, were still lethal. This shook something deeper than tactics. It messed with instincts. Every soldier learns to identify threats by sound. Rifle cracks mean one thing. Machine gun chatter means another. You react differently without even thinking about it. British rifle fire blurred that line. German troops would hear what sounded like automatic fire and respond accordingly, hugging the ground, waiting for heavy weapons to deal with it. Then they'd realize too late that the fire wasn't coming from a machine gun. It was coming from individual riflemen. That mental disconnect mattered. Your brain expected one thing, and reality delivered another. And in that moment of confusion, British rounds kept landing. One German corporal summed it up later in a simple line that spread through veteran circles. We heard machine guns. We reacted to machine guns. We died to rifles. The shame hit almost as hard as the casualties. German military culture prized technical superiority and disciplined training. Losing to a better weapon was one thing. Losing to something officially labeled obsolete was another. British soldiers were killing German infantry with rifles designed before most of those Germans were born. That ate at morale. Some German troops quietly began asking for captured British rifles, not because they thought the weapon itself was magical, but because they'd seen what trained British soldiers could do with it. Those requests were denied. Carrying enemy weapons caused confusion and raised ugly questions about confidence in German equipment. But the fact the requests happened at all said something important. Veterans don't ask for enemy weapons unless they've learned something the hard way. German intelligence eventually started connecting the dots. Captured British soldiers described endless rifle training, thousands of rounds fired in practice, drills focused entirely on speed, repetition until bolt manipulation became pure muscle memory. To German analysts, it sounded wasteful. Ammunition wasn't cheap. Time wasn't unlimited. Germany couldn't afford to train that way. Reports recommending similar training methods were quietly shelved. There simply weren't enough resources. Germany needed bullets at the front, not on training ranges. Britain, under blockade and bombing, somehow still made it work. That contradiction went largely unanswered. Understanding the system didn't make it less dangerous. By 1944, something strange started appearing in German after-action reports in Northwest Europe. Units weren't necessarily retreating from British infantry. They weren't surrendering either. They were avoiding. German troops would advance until they identified British rifle positions, then stop. They'd call for artillery. They'd request tanks. They'd wait until overwhelming force was available. Officers complained about delays. Veteran NCOs explained why. British rifle sections were too costly to assault head-on. In the Netherlands, a German company tasked with clearing a village ran into this exact problem. The enemy inside was estimated at fewer than 50 British infantry. The German company had more than double that number. On paper, the attack should have gone forward. It didn't. The men refused to enter the streets, not loudly, not in panic. They simply wouldn't move. When the commander threatened punishment, a veteran sergeant laid it out bluntly. Those British riflemen would tear the company apart before they could close distance. The commander made the call for artillery instead. Shells leveled parts of the village. When German infantry finally advanced, the British were gone. No German lives were lost, but the report noted something unsettling. Battle-hardened troops who had fought in Russia and Italy had refused to attack British infantry armed only with rifles. That wasn't fear in the usual sense. It was professional judgment. German high command found this deeply troubling. Rifles weren't supposed to dominate the battlefield. They were support weapons for machine guns, not replacements for them. But British training had turned every rifleman into something close to a light machine gun, without the drawbacks. Rifles didn't overheat as quickly. They didn't announce their position with a long burst. They didn't rely on one gunner to keep firing. 10 British riflemen could put out an incredible volume of aimed fire, enough to overwhelm a unit trained under different assumptions. And unlike a single machine gun, that fire was spread out, harder to suppress, harder to neutralize. German doctrine emphasized specialization. British doctrine emphasized making every soldier deadly. The difference showed up in body counts. A captured German officer later tried to explain this to his interrogators. From his perspective, it wasn't about bravery or morale. It was about math. When British rifle fire started, it sounded like German MGs firing at full speed, but it was coming from individuals. You couldn't suppress it easily. You couldn't rush it without taking heavy losses. Advancing into that kind of fire wasn't courage. It was suicide. The British interrogator listening to this didn't react. To him, firing 30 aimed rounds a minute wasn't special. It was normal. That disconnect tells you everything. British soldiers didn't see their rifle fire as exceptional. It was just how they'd been trained. German soldiers saw it as unnatural, and that gap between expectation and reality changed how the battlefield worked. But there's one more layer to this story, because fear alone doesn't explain why this reputation stuck for decades. What really terrified German veterans wasn't just what British rifles did, it was how quietly, reliably, and predictably they did it. And that's where the psychology of it all comes together in the final part. By the end of the war, the fear had settled into something more permanent. Not panic, not rumor, but memory. German veterans who had fought across multiple fronts didn't describe British rifle fire as surprising anymore. They described it as inevitable. Once it started, you knew exactly how bad it was going to get, and how little you could do about it. What made it worse was that there was no dramatic warning. Tanks announced themselves. You heard engines. You saw dust. You had time, sometimes, to react. Artillery gave signals too. Whistling shells. Incoming fire. Chaos that at least made sense. British riflemen gave you nothing like that. One moment, it sounded like scattered rifle shots. The next, the air was full of cracking reports so tight together, your brain interpreted it as automatic fire. And by the time you realized it wasn't, men were already down. That quiet brutality mattered. Machine guns revealed their position every time they fired. Suppressing them was dangerous, but straightforward. British rifle sections didn't present a single obvious target. The fire came from multiple points, overlapping, controlled, and steady. Trying to suppress that with return fire rarely worked. Trying to rush it usually failed. So German troops adapted the only way they could. Avoidance. Not retreat, not refusal to fight. Avoidance. If British rifle sections were identified in medium-range terrain, villages, hedgerows, narrow approaches, German units stalled until heavy support arrived. Artillery, armor, anything to break the problem before infantry had to close the distance. German officers complained about lost momentum. Veterans accepted it as survival. This behavior showed up so consistently that it became a pattern in after-action reports. British riflemen weren't described as elite troops or shock units. They were described as too dangerous to assault directly. That phrase alone tells you how deep the impression ran. Official German doctrine never changed. On paper, the Lee Enfield remained classified as an outdated bolt-action rifle. No sudden reclassification, no public acknowledgement. Unofficially, among soldiers who had faced it, the story was different. The rifle wasn't feared because of what it was. It was feared because of what it enabled. British soldiers had spent decades perfecting a philosophy of infantry combat that didn't rely on specialized weapons to dominate space. They trained every rifleman to control ground through speed and accuracy combined. Germany built squads around machine guns. Britain built squads around riflemen who could behave like machine guns when needed. That difference doesn't show up in spec sheets. It shows up when units collide. German intelligence eventually pieced the whole picture together. Interviews with prisoners, old training manuals, Battlefield reports stacked on top of each other. The conclusion was uncomfortable. Britain had turned a simple old weapon into one of the most effective infantry systems of the war, not through technology, but through obsessive training. It was a system Germany couldn't copy, not quickly, not cheaply, and not in the middle of a global war where ammunition and time were constantly running out. Knowing the reason didn't reduce the danger. By 1944 and 1945, German soldiers weren't surprised by British rifle fire anymore. They expected it, and that expectation shaped how they fought. In Normandy, Holland, and inside Germany itself, British infantry sections slowed advances out of proportion to their numbers. Units with combat experience chose patience over aggression whenever British riflemen were involved. That wasn't cowardice. It was experience talking. One captured German officer explained it plainly during questioning. Advancing into British rifle fire, he said, felt like walking into something you couldn't shut off. You couldn't outshoot it. You couldn't wait it out. And you couldn't rush it without paying heavily. The interrogator listening had no dramatic response. To him, this wasn't a revelation. It was training. That contrast, how terrifying it was to face versus how normal it felt to use, says everything about why this weapon earned its reputation. British soldiers didn't brag about their rapid rifle fire. It wasn't propaganda. It wasn't a talking point. It was routine. The technique had been around long before World War II, refined through earlier conflicts where British units often faced larger forces and survived by putting overwhelming fire downrange fast. By the time Germany encountered it again in the 1940s, the skill was deeply ingrained. The Lee Enfield itself never changed much. The soldiers did. German planners had evaluated the rifle as a piece of hardware and dismissed it. British training turned that hardware into something else entirely, a system. A British rifleman wasn't just carrying a weapon. He was the final component of a process built on repetition, stress, and speed. That's why German veterans didn't talk about being beaten by rifles. They talked about being beaten by riflemen. Decades after the war, when asked which enemy weapon he feared most, one German veteran didn't hesitate. Not tanks, not artillery, British rifles. You could see tanks coming, he explained. You could hear guns firing. But British riflemen were just soldiers with rifles until they started shooting. And by the time you realized what kind of shooting it was already too late. That's the part that stuck. The Lee Enfield wasn't terrifying because it was new. It was terrifying because Britain had spent generations making sure every soldier knew how to use it at a level their enemies never fully understood until they were on the receiving end. Sometimes the most dangerous weapon isn't the one that looks advanced. It's the one your enemy has practiced with long enough to make it unstoppable. If you want more WW2 stories that dig into the details most people miss, hit like and stick around because the next one goes even deeper.